the East Coast Sunrise people of the Yuin Nation, and the Southern Island and Saltbush peoples of the Nione peoples of Tasmania. Today and always, we pay our deep respects to the custodians, those who went before and those who will follow, as the knowledge holders of tomorrow. This is Australia.
Hello everyone, and here we are live in Coonawarra. We're here in Boandik country. Locally we sometimes refer to Pinchunga, depending on what age we're talking about from the history. But I'm here in Eric Brand's old cellar in the Brand Winery, which we're really thankful. It's a very special place here. There's been some beautiful dinners and tastings here over the years. And I'm joined here with well over 100 years of Coonawarra winemaking knowledge and some wines and food, and we're going to have a great discussion tonight around these wines. So I want to acknowledge the Boandik people. We live in a land surrounded by amazingly large eucalyptus gum trees that sit with their feet in the aquifer in the limestone underneath us. So most of you will have heard of the terroir soils of Coonawarra. The aquifers beneath them, there's two. Those trees that we are surrounded by, some of them over 1,000 years old, carry a lot of canoe scars. So it's a very special area that's always supported a population of people very well. So we acknowledge those ancestors of our past, and then the people here present and the future. So with me today I've got 3 winemakers. We were to have a fourth, and I am a stand-in. We were to have Karina Wright and then Jacinta Jenkins joining us as well, but unfortunately they both have COVID and so can't be with us. So we wish them well. It's a tough time in vintage to have to deal with that. So we hope both of you recover soon. So with me, I'm joined by not only winemakers of well renown, 3 firefighters from Coonawarra. So to my immediate right, I've got the current captain of the Coonawarra CFS, Bruce Gregory, who some of you may know as the winemaker of the Magella wines. And then to his right, I've got Bruce Redman, who had his 15 minutes or at least 15 years of fame as the captain of the CFS, but he just holds a hose now. And then I think it's admin and finance on the end of the CFS, Luke Tokashu from Patrick of Coonawarra. So we probably won't focus so much on the firefighting. We'll look at the wines in front of us. So we're going to talk about climate, soils, wine styles, history, some of the fashions that we've seen come and go, and I think we'll all learn a little bit more, and we'll have some some space for you to have discussion either amongst yourselves. So if you're looking at your screen, you should see, I think on the right-hand side, there's a spot that you can do chat amongst yourselves, and we encourage that to make it interesting. And there's also an area for Q&A, and we will endeavour to get to some of those questions, and if we don't, they will be answered afterwards. So please engage. We know that not everyone has the wines in front of them, but those that don't, you'll have to go out and get some to have a look, because I'm sure your taste buds will be savouring by the end of it. So I'm going to pass first to B2, Bruce Gregory, to give us a little bit of background on some of the history of the icons of Coonawarra.
Thank you, Sue. And look, we must have certainly acknowledged that Sue has been very gracious in her time. She had very limited knowledge of her coming to actually mediate tonight or moderate tonight. So thank you on behalf of everyone here. So that must be noted. It is quite a hard task to do in such short notice, and I can appreciate what you've actually had to cram this evening. So, well, anyway, first of all, thank you, Sue, and good morning from Coonawarra, Australia. Signature Cabernets. Presently, over 50% of Coonawarra plantings are Cabernet Sauvignon, but that wasn't always the case. Decades ago, it was the reverse, with Shiraz being the predominant variety. Small plantings of Cabernet Sauvignon have been widely used in multi-regional blends, and we've lost our identity. But icons from the 40s, 50s and 60s, like Woodley's Wines Treasure Chest series, and the Penfolds Bin 60A, the Mildara wines, Peppermint Patty, all these wines had Coonawarra and and Cabernet Sauvignon, and we started to have an identity. So certainly from the 80s, we look at Lindeman's St. George, the Wynns Coonawarra, John Reddock Estate, and these are all true icon wines. These wines have made what Coonawarra is today. So in the 90s, when we were able to benefit from the plantings that was happening in the 70s, was allowing more producers to actually benefit from their viticultural practices, like Brand's Lera wines, Catnock Estate and Yalumba wines. So Brand's is where we are here at the moment, which is a beautiful old cellar, and there's a lot of history here, which we'll go into later on this evening. Their viticultural practices had become unique in a way of making Coonawarra and Cabernet Sauvignon the truly backbone of what wines are today, either as blending wines or as wines as a straight varietal. Now, several decades on, we'll be looking at producers and focusing on what Cabernet has become and the different styles that people are producing. The ability to age a wine and to look at some of the great Coonawarra producers of the wines today. So these 6 wines on offer will differ in winemaking techniques, viticultural practices and taste. They will be very, very different and unique. So we'll discuss the nuances and give an insight into the producers. So I hope we'll actually enjoy them all and have a lot to discuss. So thank you, Sue.
Oh, you're welcome. So I'll pass on to B1, and that order, B1, B2 comes, I think it's not to do with hair, it's more to do with seniority of age. So over to you, Bruce Redman. So Bruce Redman, obviously from the famed Redman family winery in Coonawarra.
It's my duty to give a very potted history of Coonawarra. The region's been going for almost over 130 years now, and I'm nowhere near that old. The first site was identified in Coonawarra for vineyards in 1890, and it was on John Reddock's land. Back in those days, there wasn't too much science involved. So the main parameter to identify what would become the Coonawarra wine region was the Terra Rossa soil. And I think tonight we'll talk about Terra Rossa soil quite a bit because it is a very major influence. So there was about 1,200 acres of Terra Rossa soil identified, and that was subdivided into 10-acre lots, which was sold to various people in an auction in 1891. sorry, in 1890, and the first vineyards were planted in 1891. Bruce has alluded a little bit to some of the varietal changes over the years. And as I'm on a very short leash, I'll go forward very quickly. Basically, today we're a much larger region from a very humble beginnings of 1,200 acres. We're up over 12,000 acres of vineyards now. So it's been a fairly stop-start evolution. It hasn't been smooth sailing all the way, but we've got there eventually. And I guess the main thing is we've gone from 10-acre blocks with people growing vines and vegetables and fruit trees to today where we consist of a region where we've got multinational companies down to the smallest artisan winemaker. And because we're relatively just logistically isolated and all our vineyards are on the Terra Rossa soil, so they're very close to each other, we're a very tight-knit community. I think as you've worked out before, we've got a fire brigade which is staffed, a volunteer fire brigade which is staffed mainly by winemakers. We've also got, Sue's going to fall over in shock when I say this, we've also got a very high proportion of female winemakers and viticulturists in this region. So we've got a good mix of very young and very old people in the region. The other thing we've got, and it's tomorrow night, so I know you can't make it, is the Coonawarra Community Club Tea Night, which happens the last Friday in every month, where winemakers volunteer once a year to cook meals for the rest of the community. And we sit down and we eat a steak or a piece of fish and enjoy a glass of wine and talk about the region. So with that, I'll
not to mention the amazing salads that grace the pool table.
Yes.
And how competitive they are, or the Coonawarra tomato competition that
Exactly.
happens each year.
I was running out of time, so I didn't have time for all of that.
If you do happen to make it to tea night, if you're watching from more local than international, you can go to the bar and be served by Luke Tokashu, who's taking a break from vintage activities, because we're not in the middle of vintage down here, but vintage is definitely kicking in. So, most whites are off and people have definitely started into the reds. Coonawarra's cooler, so we're a bit later than some of the other regions if you're watching social media activity of various wineries in Australia. So Luke's going to touch a little bit more on some of the reasons why that is the case.
Thanks, Sue. So I'm just going to touch on the soil and the climate of Coonawarra very briefly. We don't have a lot of time to talk about the nuances of our climate down here, but one of the defining factors that I guess everyone should know of, if you've heard of Coonawarra, is the Terra Rossa soil. And what that is a shallow red clay loam over a limestone base. And it's quite an exclusive bit of land. So it's only 27 kilometres long down the Coonawarra Strip and only about 2 kilometres wide. So quite an exclusive piece of land that winemakers like us love to grow our grapes on. That shallow clay layer at the top allows the roots of the vine to just penetrate a little bit into that to get a little bit of the nutrient from that top layer. But then the limestone underneath is really free draining, so we don't get waterlogged vines, and it really controls the growth of Cabernet Sauvignon specifically, which is part of the reason that they do so well. The vines like to struggle a little bit to put all their energy into the fruit. We are quite a cool climate down here, so it's about as furthest south in Australia that you can ripen Cabernet Sauvignon, so a bit further south than here is really struggling to ripen. So we're right on that brink of being able to ripen Cabernet. And we do get some warm days over summer, but fortunately we've got a phenomenon called the Bonnie upwelling, which happens in the Southern Ocean, which is only about half an hour from here, so not too far. And that is cool water from the deep comes up to the surface, and that cools the air, and we get the afternoon breezes here. And Coonawarra nights are notoriously cold if you've ever been here over vintage. That extends the growing season of the vines and specifically Cabernet, which is great. You're getting a lot finer tannin when you're extending that growing season, some nice acidity and of course fresh flavour. And the fineness of tannin that that Coonawarra is really renowned for, and I think you'll see in some of the wines tonight. We won't touch on climate change too much tonight, but there are a lot of sort of innovative practices that are coming out of Coonawarra, and it's really good to see that future proofing that it is happening down here. A couple of those one of those is a rootstock trial that we're doing. We've got a small vineyard here planted all to Cabernet with different rootstocks on there. So that's a really interesting way to compare the performance of those and just make wine out of those and then see how the vines handle different seasons. The other one is an irrigation project, which is really interesting. And we've got some thermal sensors across multiple vineyards in Coonawarra. And that allows us to monitor the temperatures of the canopy of the vines and really work out our irrigation and work out when to water and how the vines are doing. And that's really one of the defining factors to control our precious resource, which is our underground water that we have here. So I'd like to hand back to Sue and we'll have a look at some wines.
Thank you. We really do have cold nights. I mean, last night in parts of Coonawarra it was down to between 2 and 4 degrees. So we're heading into autumn. You can hear the magpie song has changed into that autumn weather, and that means that, you know, Cabernet harvest isn't far away. So it is nice to have that cool night preserving acid, but it also gives us cool weather for harvesting, which I think really maintains freshness of fruit, and I hope that you'll see that through some of these wines. So from the discussion we've had so far, we've learnt that I think Coonawarra, we're the original hipsters with our vegetables, our way of country community life, and thrill seekers in that we go swimming and diving in freezing cold ocean, you know, filled with white pointers. On that, making Cabernet in a cool climate is another way of thrill seeking, and I think you'll see that with these wines. So we might start with wine number 1, Bruce Gregory.
Yes, thank you, Sue. Yes, we're starting with a younger wine first, which is a 2019 Coonawarra Wines Wanderlust Cabernet Sauvignon. Coonawarra Wines Vineyard is on the eastern side of Coonawarra Township, so we're on the edge of the Red Strip, and the viticultural focus is certainly on sustainability, healthy ecosystems, companion growing, soil microbes, soil carbon levels, predatory insects, and canopy management. Certified organic, their vines are home to a range of insects and grubs. Drew and Nicole Reski, who are owners of Coonawarra Vineyards, spent a lot of time in the vineyard looking for balance between vine health, irrigation management, and cropping levels. The viticultural practice really produces low crop levels with intense berry flavours. I had a nice chat with Drew when we were gathering some information for this. As was said earlier, I'm actually not the winemaker here. I'm the winemaker for Magella, which we'll talk about earlier. But I had a very good chat with him, and he's very much focused on his organic practices and sustainability. So that was something that was very, very strong that came through all the way. His grapes, they're actually machine picked and transported to a contract facility locally and made under the supervision of winemaker Peter Douglas. Their fermentation practices, it's small batch fermentation. So they're looking at very small parcels put into 5-ton fermenters, and they're fermented to dryness. And for anyone that is interested, malolactic fermentation is a sequential fermentation. It's aged in 100% French oak, and then it's off to bottling. So they don't use a lot of fining. They're looking at a very natural process from the vineyard all the way through to the winemaking and then further on to the bottle. So I don't know of you've got wines, but I had a look at this wine earlier, and of the rest of our panel, I can discuss it while we're having a little bit of a talk about it. But I saw some nice bright red colour, some dark red fruits, and possibly a little bit of briar on the nose. So it was a well-weighted wine. Palate structure was ripe fruits, had some nice layered grainy tannin. So it was more of a wine that was a palate structure. So it was, and really Australia we do focus a lot on fruit, fresh fruit, and this wine was quite a well-weighted wine, so it had a nice good length of palate and some nice mouthfeel. So I thought it was a pretty good wine. There was certainly no question. They've got the balance between natural acid and the tannin well done. It was a great wine.
And the texture, like if you think if you look at those of you that have booklets, you've got a map, or if you're looking at this online, you can flick through to the map. That map actually shows you where Coonawarra's cellar door is, which is in Penola, so to the south. Their vineyard is probably actually closer to the Redmond vineyard. So if you're trying to place the taste in terms of the map, it's up closer to Redmond's. And we definitely see throughout Coonawarra differences in how fragrance is expressed. But then obviously with Cabernet, texture and tannin is really important. And something I see of some winemakers when they come to the region is they're so focused on, extraction of colour and tannin, whereas I think if anything you need to be really careful. Here we have that in abundance, and that is a beautifully textured wine.
Yeah, that's what I liked about this wine. It had a beautiful texture, and it was the palate weight that was absolutely wonderful. I think because it was 2019, they were quite low cropping levels. Each vintage has its own set of issues, and 2019 we didn't have big crops, so. Drew and Nicole were able to get very small berries, very low cropping levels, which is an intense flavour. So those sort of things are an advantage when it comes to looking at what they're doing in the vineyard, and it follows all the way through to the winery, and then consequently follows into the bottle, which is great. I think this is going to be a wine that's going to hang around for a few years, and they're running very low sulphur levels. They're not, when you're looking at organic, they're following that process all the way through. Because it's going to a contract facility, then they can only be organic in the vineyard. But this wine, I think, is a beautiful one. It really is.
A lovely freshness about it too. That perfume, fruit, and nice supple tannins.
Yeah. I think it's great. I really do. It's something that you can look back. It's bottled. And it has been in bottle for a little while. It's 14% alcohol, so it's got a reasonable mouthfeel, so you get that nice glycerol mouthfeel as well. So, and I think we can certainly enjoy that in 10 years' time. So,
and tannin's a pretty good natural preservative as well. Which
yes, it is.
Doesn't
yes, very much so.
Look at us. I mean, we're looking amazing for our
That's right. Thank you, Sue. I think unless one of our other guys wants to make a quick comment, I'm pretty happy with how that wine's come up and what Drew and Nicole have been doing in the vineyard. It's been wonderful.
Nice segue into the next wine, which is the same vintage, and there is no one better to speak about this wine than Bruce Redmond.
Thanks, Sue and Bruce. Just a little bit of background first. My grandfather, Bill Redmond, came to Coonawarra in 1901 and worked at what's now Wynn's Winery for 8 years, or 7 years, I should say, and then bought his first vineyard in 1908. So the Redmond family is nearly as old as the region itself. Some people say, I look nearly that old too. I guess having had that long association with the region, my grandfather started, as I said, in 1908, and my dad started in 1937 back with his father. My brother and I started with our father in 1982. So I was born and bred in the region, so I've seen the region change from very, very small, almost a hobby industry to what it is today. And with that change, there's been a change in wine styles, but in the case of the Redmond winemaking, it's very much we use a very traditional method that's been handed down by my father and grandfather. Having said that, we have tinkered around the edges. We've used obviously we've I won't say we've improved things in the vineyard, but we've altered things in the vineyards to help get more fruit intensity and flavour and colour in the wines. And it's really interesting. This is it's a 2019, and it's actually the 50th release of the Redmond Cabernet Sauvignon under the yellow label, which you just saw before. And 2019 was a year that was quite a cool year in relative terms to Coonawarra. So the wines are very medium-bodied. Both ours and the Coonawarra wines are medium-bodied with some lovely intensity of fruit. It's got some real violets and red berry fruit on the nose. It's quite a juicy Cabernet. We don't use a lot of oak. It's just a touch, a hint of oak to give the nose some lift. And then on the palate, it's got some lovely fruit richness, but it's still really medium-bodied and some really fine-grained. Somebody said, and I don't really know what graphite tannins taste like, but somebody said it's got some graphite-like tannins as well. But it's what we'd say is a really good Redmond Coonawarra Cabernet, where it's really elegant but with intensity of flavour. The thing we try to aim for is longevity. So the wines are balanced as young wines, but they've still got a nice acid and tannin line, which means that they will age. We're hoping to do a tasting shortly where we'll taste every vintage from 1970 through until 2018, whatever we are now, 22. So we'll be 50. Instead of doing a 50-year tasting because of the COVID thing was postponed, we'll do it at 50 plus 1 or 2 or 3. But the wine, having a look at some of those older wines, they still are beautiful wines. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of Coonawarra going through, is that the wines are quite delicious as young wines, but they have got the ability to age really gracefully. And to see wines that are Coonawarra Cabernet, especially that's 10 or 15 or even 20 years old, is quite a treat. Most people haven't got the patience to hold them that long. So I think that just about covers it for me. Thanks, Sue.
So Bruce, sorry, the year that you said that your grandfather came here?
01.
1901.
Yeah.
So it's actually the Redmond's second pandemic.
Yes.
In Coonawarra. There you go. Yeah. That's resilience.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
I had to think about that for a second.
Yeah. So I just love the fragrance of that wine. And I think often when people talk about Coonawarra Cabernet, it's always about tannin, and some people are frightened of tannins, or they're frightened of, wines, thinking it's something that, their father's or grandfather's cellar. And I think fragrance is so underspoken in Cabernet, and that wine jumps out of the class. Beautiful fragrance. And you use open fermenters for this one.
Yep.
But you've got a couple of different fermenters. Do you select different ones?
This is all the Cabernet's all open fermenters. So yeah, we don't use any of the static overhead statics so it's all open fermentation for the Cabernet.
Yeah.
As I said, it's very traditional.
So strong arms in the Redmond family too.
Yeah. Keeps us fit.
Strong arms and brown hair.
Yeah. Clean living. Good red wine.
Bruce, I do have a quick question. You were looking at, because you've been going for 100 years, almost 100 years, we can say there's been you've kept the tradition, but you've also changed some of the technology, because tannins 100 years ago really were the benchmark to age wines, whereas now this is, as Sue said, this is so elegant. It's a beautiful wine.
Yeah.
How does the winemaking changed in that time, with the presses which would have given you the tannin then to what you're doing now?
I remember when I used to be in the winery with my old man, he'd always say that the wine, you had to be able to drink the wine straight out of the fermenter. It had to have balance as a young wine. So I think that was the problem. A lot of Australian wines were over tannic. So you'd say, well, put it away and the tannins will soften out, and they never ever did.
Yeah.
Whereas Coonawarra wines, because the tannins were so fine, they were still in balance with the weight of the wine. So they were astringent, but not overpoweringly astringent. You could still drink them, but you just had a bit more grippiness. So I think it's open fermenting, which doesn't extract quite as much tannin because it's gentler on the ferment, and probably a bit earlier picking, so that you're not getting the really overripe tannins. You're getting ripe tannins, but not overripe tannins.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
And coming on from an organic vineyard, Redmond's, you harvest and destem in the field. So you're leaving the stems in your vineyards. You're leaving that organic matter there.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, a fantastic practice that you might want to explain to people that are watching.
I think we should move on to the next wine, Sue.
I love it.
No, I'm conscious of time, and I'd hate to.
The next wine that we have is going to be spoken about by Luke, and this is from Rymel. And now we've gone from looking at two wines closer to each other to now a wine that represents, I guess, the north and south. Luke.
Yeah, so we're looking at the 2018 Rymel Classic Cabernet here. So the Rymel family have a long history in Coonawarra, right back to the 1970s when they actually opened the winery here. And Peter Rymel that opened it was actually the great-grandson of John Riddoch, who basically started Coonawarra. So the same as Redmond's, have a very long history here of growing grapes, and certainly you can see that experience that shows through in the wines. This is the 2018 vintage. 2018 was a fantastic year, quite warm and dry for Coonawarra standards. The only issue in 2018 was a little bit of frost in early days of vintage, so that lowered the crop levels quite a bit. So I remember the vintage being excellent quality, but we all wish we just had a little bit more of it. As Sue mentioned, this wine is from two vineyards, one around the Rymel Winery, which is to the north of Coonawarra, and then the other right down the south. And so the two parcels are picked separately, fermented separately, and then blended as a final wine. It's fermented in 5-ton open fermenters and hand plunged every day, sometimes 6 to 8 times a day through the middle of fermentation, and then goes into oak for around 20 months, and about 30% of that oak is new. So quite similar styles of winemaking to the previous wines, obviously a different vintage, and so it should be interesting to have a look. I think it's this wine it's got some nice sort of dube characters. Initially, it was a little bit closed on my glass, but it's sort of opening up to a little bit more dried, herb, and savoury characters. The oak is really well integrated, and I think that the tannins are present, a little bit sort of grainier tannins maybe than the 19 vintages, but certainly in balance and within style expected of this wine. So looks pretty good.
Bruce, you made a comment.
Yeah, just a quick question with regards to the aromatics that you would get from north part of Coonawarra to south part of Coonawarra. I see we're talking of sort of the dubey notes and maybe some savoury notes in that wine. Do you think that there's an impact that is coming from either north or the north end of Coonawarra as opposed to the south end of Coonawarra in that wine?
Yeah, I think so. I think they come together quite well. I mean, I see that north Coonawarra being more that red fruit and dube character, and then the southern end, which is the cooler end for us, is generally more that savoury, bit more spice, some sage, dried herbs, and those sort of characters. And so I see that both of those in this wine at the same time, which I think is can be attributed from blending those two regions together and getting that sort of balance of fruit, bit of savouriness in there, and that nice tannin that runs, sort of joins it all together on the finish.
It's quite a nice marriage of tannin between the two parcels, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, it certainly is. I think I see the wine very similar to you as well. When we were looking at them before, I see there's a nice balance of oak with it, and I do enjoy it. It's a subtle tannin structure. It's quite elegant. It's a nose that I think that we can get from north and south of Coonawarra. I think is actually quite nice.
Yeah,
it's a wonderful one.
It's not a big distance between the vineyards in relative terms, but
I guess geographically it's not, but from a physiologically, it is a huge distance when it comes to getting physiological ripeness in the vineyards.
I mean, it'd be roughly 20 kilometres. Yeah. And yet, ripening-wise, if you look across Coonawarra, there's probably 4 weeks in difference between north and south, depending on the season. It stretches out, or it can be more compressed in a different year. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to move on now to the Balnaves of Coonawarra, and it's a shame that we haven't got JJ here. We hope you're doing well, JJ, and get better. It's hard work making wine from home. So this is the 2016, the Tally, so one of the more modern icon wines of Coonawarra. And I'm going to pass to Bruce Redmond to speak about this one.
I was going to say dobbed in. I got nominated to speak about this wine because Doug Balnaves, who set up the Balnaves Winery, and I share a great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, so we're very distantly related, so I'm very familiar with the wine. Doug, as you've probably gathered, was a born and bred local. And he originally was a farmer and a shearer, and that's where the name the Tally came from. The tally is when you're shearing sheep, the shearer adds the number of sheep he shears for the 2-hour shift that they do of shearing, and that's the tally that he has for the day. And of course, they add it up at the end of the day, and the tally you have at the end of the day is not only how much you get paid, but if you shear the most sheep, you can brag about how good you are. And so when the Balnaves family was coming up with a name for their premium wine, they settled on the Tally, which says a lot about the regional characteristics and also Doug's heritage. Doug sold his sheep grazing farm to a vineyard company and they appointed him as the manager of the vineyard manager. Well, Doug, as I said, was a shearer and a farmer and knew a little bit about vineyards, but due to again, this harks back to the community of Coonawarra, but due to the goodwill and generosity of the people who lived in Coonawarra, they took Doug under their wing and taught him the way to grow grapes and make wine in Coonawarra. Doug did so well that he became so confident that he thought he'd start his own winery. And in 1990, he built a cellar door sales and made a little bit of wine, which he sold through cellar door. He had it made under contract from his own vineyards. Then in the early 90s, he said, well, I'm going to build my own winery. And from there on, it's been a success story. They make a range of wines and grow a range of grapes. This wine is, as I said, is their flagship wine. It's a 2016 wine, and it was interesting. I was talking to Kirsty, who's Doug's daughter, today to get all the inside information, and she sent me the details. And it was really interesting to read that they in 2016 they picked the Cabernet for this wine in late March. Well, we're in late March now, and no one's picking Cabernet in Coonawarra, and I don't think they will be for the next couple of years. So you can see that 2016 was a warmer year in Coonawarra. I think it was also relatively low yielding, so that brought the ripening forward a bit as well. The wine itself is starting to drink beautifully now. It's lost some of its really primary fruit characters, but it's starting to develop some secondary characters with hints of those primary fruit characters still there. So you can still see bits of dark berry and cassis, but that's starting to be overtaken a bit by some more earthy, more cedary oak rather than the vanilla oak that you get in younger wines. And on the palate, it's a really intense, with lots of flavour, with lots and lots of layers. And it's really the tannins are really starting to soften out, and it's a really delicious wine on the palate at the moment. Drinking beautifully, but having said that, it's still on the palate, it's quite youthful and fresh, and still got vibrancy, which suggests that you could stick it away in the cellar for another 5 years and be more than happy with it. It's a wine that over the years that the Balnaves have received a great number of accolades for, and I think are rightfully very proud of the wine. For those who are lucky enough to have a glass in front of them, it's very Moorish.
That's right.
I think that oak in there is really, it's present, which sort of reminds you of that, this is a premium wine. It's got some real longevity in there, but I mean, it's really well integrated at the same time, and that tannin structure is something that I think this quality of wine can really carry, and this is what aging Coonawarra Cabernet is all about.
There's that darkness of fruit and complexity of tannin, both from the fruit when it was picked. I think that longer maceration that I know they've always played around with, and then I note the Petit Verdot in that, which
it's probably something to note. This is the only wine in the lineup that has got a bit of Petit Verdot in there. I think it's 6.5% in this wine. So I think talking to JJ last week, she said it really just gives it that lift, and that perfume really comes from that Petit Verdot in there. Yeah,
really complex, deep wine.
Bruce, just a quick question for you on the tannin structure. Do you think that tannin, we were discussing winemaking styles. At the moment, we've just seen varying styles of fermentation, and now we're looking at some form of extended maceration. Do you think the tannin structure is coming from the seeds or skins or oak?
I think this wine has got tannin from both skins and seeds and oak. I think because it's probably, again, I'm not being that intimately involved. I think their longer maceration gives you seeds and skins. It's quite ripe. It's 14.5%.
It's not a bitter tannin.
No. It's a beautiful soft tannin.
Yeah, that's right. And we look at winemaking styles, and we think it's such a different style to some of the previous wines. But it's a beautiful one, and I think it's going to age for a heck of a lot longer than 5 years. I think it's going to be there for a long time.
Yeah. Well, if you can resist drinking it.
Oh, very true.
We may knock it off tonight.
That's right. We'll finish it tonight.
Thank you very much. And it's a beautiful representation. And the Balnaves family epitomise everything that we've talked about tonight with regards to commitment to community and, the vineyards that they look after and sell to, many other winemakers outside of the region, and contract management as well as their own. So they're small but players across a wide field. So now we move on to the Patrick of Coonawarra, and this is the home block. So on your map, this one isn't that far away from Balnaves. So we're looking at a different vintage, the 2015, but it's across the road and just down the strip a little bit. So Luke, another stellar vintage 2015 in Coonawarra's history.
Yeah, the vintage 2015, from my memory of it, was an easy vintage. So everything ripened really evenly, and we picked one variety after the other, and it was one of those nice, easy vintages, cooler than the 16 vintage, but allowed that sort of ripeness of tannin to come through as well. So Patrick of Coonawarra was started by my dad, Patrick, in 2004. He worked for a number of other wineries for 30-odd years before starting our own winery. He came down to Coonawarra in 1989 brought me and the family with him, and he was a winemaker for Holick for 10 years before we purchased this vineyard, the home block, from Hollick's and the house that we lived in at the time. And basically it's a 1 hectare vineyard around the family home where I grew up. So I spent a lot of time in this vineyard as a kid, so earned a lot of pocket money pruning the vines, walking the rows intimately. And I say that gives me a good knowledge of the vineyard and each row individually, but sometimes I don't know about that. So this wine is fermented in open fermenters again, and then goes into oak for a little bit longer. So some extended maceration in that fermenter for sometimes 2 to 3 to 4 weeks, just to pick up a little bit of extra tannin, a bit more structure to the wine. And then goes into oak for around 20 to 24 to 28 months, so quite a long time. And during that time, the oak and the tannin from the maceration really start to integrate, and that's sort of what gives this wine longevity. I certainly see this having quite a subtle sort of nose to it. So a lot of that primary fruit is still some red berries and plum in there, but it's sort of taking a bit of a back seat at the moment. It's quite earthy, I guess, with a nice sort of dark berry fruits, quite a complex palate. But for me, the palate structure and the weight is what this wine is all about. It's sort of the oak tannin's really lovely and balanced, and it really comes together, and it really shines after 7 years now in the bottle.
2015 and 2018, I recall as being great vintages with regards to rapid fruit set.
Yeah.
So I feel like we're starting to see that the better seasons are when the weather conditions are kind in spring, and we get that evenness of ripening, and that evenness of tannin in 18 and 15 is really lovely.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's warm, dry spring that we can get, and we did have this year as well, that sort of that rapid fruit set, and then veraison's quite even, and you're not getting those green berries and the ripe berries on the same bunch. So yeah, that certainly has a good part to play in those years when you do get that nice warmth coming into vintage.
Yeah, it's delicious.
Your home block, which is just to the west of Coonawarra, there's the cigar shape.
Mm-hmm.
So with regards to that, have you seen much change? And I know you're making wines from other parts of Coonawarra. Do you see that as quite a unique little block, and it produces a year in, year out? Has the home block always been produced?
Yeah, it's an interesting vineyard because it's right on the fringe of the Terra Rossa. So the front of the vineyard is really shallow, and then it's only 100 metres maybe to the back of the vineyard, but then it starts to get sort of deeper, darker soil there. So managing the vineyard is quite difficult because you've got a lot of soil types within the same vineyard. And I think that when you're picking all on the same day, that sort of gives you a depth of flavour, and you're getting sort of riper fruit from the Terra Rossa side, and then maybe sort of some of that more spice and earthiness coming from that deeper soils towards the back of the vineyard.
Yeah.
I note that yours is clone SA125, and if you look through some of the wines, we've got SA125, Renella Selection, Magella Selection, Rimal. I think, something that we're seeing with the replantings of vineyards in Coonawarra, there's been a real focus on clonal selection, but it's not just been new clones. There's been the heritage clones, so the clones that have adapted and shown that they're good here. I don't know if any of you would like to comment on that. Clonal selection or clones in Cabernet?
I'd be quite happy. I know there's been a lot of work done with clones, but certainly from a Magella point of view, which will come up in a minute actually, but we've been very happy with some of the traditional clones. Part of Magella's selection actually came from some of the original plantings of Cabernet Sauvignon and Coonawarra. So these cuttings were taken because they were consistently producing good quality fruit, and they were great. The new clonal work that's being done is wonderful because there's a changing climate. We need to adapt, but certainly, and that's part of the work that the discussion you had earlier on, is that there's been some fantastic work going on to see the changes that are happening.
Yeah, and certainly work that needs to keep happening because we're learning everything more and more as each vintage passes.
Yes.
Yeah. And, each vintage we see so different, so I think that's what really adds to the collectability of wines from climates like ours is that each season tells its story and the wine's really expressed. And I think we can see that across some of the seasons here as well as the location of vineyards and winemaking. Yeah. So we might move on to the Magella wine. So back to B2.
Back to B2, yes, thank you, Sue. Yes, Magella wines. This is 2015 Cabernet Sauvignon. I guess that there's the map of Coonawarra. We're on the eastern edge of the Coonawarra Strip, so we're a little bit further south than the Coonawarra wine, but really on the same road, but further south. So Magella was started by two brothers, Brian and Anthony Lynn. They're mixed farming. The first vines were planted in 1968. When I say mixed plantings, they've got sheep. They have two other farms, and that's how they made the money years ago. Most farmers diversified. So early on, they sold their grapes to other wineries, and by sheer coincidence, Luke's father was one of the recipients of the Magella fruit early on, which I think is probably a pretty good time, actually. So the first wine was made in 1991. That was made under contract, actually, where we are at the moment.
Tough year to start.
Yes,
91.
It was a tough year, 1991, from a Shiraz. And a quick history, I was actually here in 1991, so I made the first Magella wine. And then we built a winery, 5-6 years later. So I then moved over full-time with Magella. But from the early days, we were very happy with the quality of wine that was coming off that block. So there was some more plantings going on. As I said, the first plantings were 1968. The second plantings, there was a big push in the mid-70s. Then there was another big push in the 90s. And then there's been another big push for plantings. So we've got nearly 70 hectares at the moment under vine. It's machine pruned and machine harvested. And we treat a lot of these blocks as individual parcels, so we treat everything as a unique area. Most of the vines that we have, or most of the blocks that we have, are under their own roots. So as we said earlier, we've established our root system from a mother vine, which came from part of the original plantings from Coonawarra, and then from there we've taken cuttings and grown out our vineyards. There are two blocks that are a little bit later that we've actually planted under a clonal selection just to have some different styles that come through. They'll ripen a little bit later. But at the moment, we're pretty happy with what we've been doing and how we've been managing it. As I said, it's machine pruned, machine harvested. The bulk of our vineyard is under Cabernet Sauvignon, so we've got 70% under Cabernet Sauvignon, 25% under Shiraz, and the rest is Merlot and Riesling. Probably what makes us a little bit not different, but we tend to pick quite low crops, and we do tend to pick a little bit earlier than some of the other parcels from within Coonawarra. So we're getting different flavours when it comes to that sort of thing, and we're chasing a different style of wine, which is unique to us, which certainly fits within the style of Magella. So as I said, it's all machine pruned, machine harvested. So mechanisation is something that we had to do years ago with both Brian and Anthony deciding that you couldn't get hand pickers, you couldn't get hand pruners. So we mechanised very early on, and that's worked for us. We're quite happy with that. 2015 vintage, I think, has been spoken of before. We're very happy with how that vintage has come up. They weren't big crops. We had intense flavours from very small berries, and it's been a great wine. From a winemaking point of view, before we actually look at the wine, we're probably a little bit different to a lot of the other guys. We're 100% barrel fermentation, so we actually do small batches, and it's all barrel fermentation. So we've had extended maceration with the Balnaves, and now we've gone from one extreme of sitting on skins for a period of time for us to actually sitting on skins for only 5 days, and then it'll be pressed off and then head off to barrel to finish primary fermentation and finish malolactic fermentation. So those sort of things just makes us a little bit different, a bit unique. And what we're looking at doing is getting sort of fruitcake complexity out of that wine. We want tannin and we want structure and complexity, as has been spoken early on, because you get elegance from Coonawarra Cabernet. But we actually want to have some ability to look at the wine as a young wine and enjoy it as a young wine, but also appreciate it when you can age it for 10 or 20 years. So from a winemaking point of view, that's how we're doing it. We're a very small team, and we tend to have that style of wine that we're quite happy with. When you look at the wine itself, I see some nice red berries, nice cassis, which is quite typical of where we're coming from, almost minty notes. We have that fruitcake complexity that we get from a barrel fermentation, and the dusty tannins which we'll get from the French oak that we use. So, and it has a nice crisp acid line, which is something that will help within the aging process. So these wines tend to look their best at the moment. We're getting into a wine that's got some primary fruit, but it's also now looking at secondary fruits. We haven't even got to the tertiary fruits. So, and likewise with the previous 2015, these wines are still quite young and they'll age for a very long time.
Something that has always impressed me about Magella wines is their aromatics. And, you know, the way you've described that unashamedly, you know, your use of oak, and yet the aromatics of the fruit always speaks higher than that. Is that your winemaking? Is it the site?
Well, it's certainly something that we focus on. We really do. You can use different yeasts that will suppress those sort of characters. You can pick it a little bit later, and it's 14.5%, so there's quite a lot of alcohol mouthfeel about it, so you get the nice glycerol mouthfeel. But I think that's site selection when it comes to it, because basically the eastern edge of Coonawarra does have those sort of aromatics, and we can accentuate those. That certainly becomes very much a thumbprint. That's a Magella wine. That's what we want people to enjoy. This is a Magella wine. And in 10 years' time, they can still say that's a Magella wine. So we're very happy with that. So that's really how I see that aromatics, and it's something that we really try and focus on.
There's been some comments coming back, thank you, to people that are engaging in conversation. And one of them's talking about, Coonawarra was famous, back to the peppermint patty, or, lots of people talk about the minty characters that people have seen in Coonawarra Cabernets, but not so much in this array of wines. Where does the panel see Coonawarra in terms of those aromatics?
Because I was just chatting, and I think I can appreciate where you're going, but I think wine styles change. People want to look for different things and different aromatics. There are some wines that do have some nice cassis and some typically Coonawarra Cabernet traits. But there are winemaking techniques now, and the consumers actually want something slightly differently. The peppermint patty, it's a great wine now, and it's got the ability to age, but it's the most spearminty thing that I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. So when it was a young Cabernet, it would have been a very young Cabernet. Mm. So we're picking them a little bit riper now, and I think that has some benefit. We actually have the ability to actually pick wines at their best, and I think palate structure and ageability is something that goes a long way. I don't know what the other guys think.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly see some of that character through these wines, and I always say you can pick a Coonawarra Cabernet in an international lineup straight away, and it's not until you sort of look at a broader range of wines that you do sort of pick that up. But really that mintiness, I think it's a delicious Cabernet trait. Something that, yeah, as you said, picking later, we will certainly move away from those green tannins and that sort of grittiness that we might have had when we did pick earlier, more to that primary fruit. I mean, all of these wines have got a lovely perfumed aroma about them, which I think is probably a hallmark that the new style of Coonawarra is really embracing, and these wines represent that really well.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The Peppermint Patty as a young wine was really overpowering mintiness. And I think today mint is just one aspect of a whole range of flavours. Yeah, so it's rather than being a one-dimensional wine, they're multi-dimensional now, and that's the difference between a lot of those old Coonawarra wines, and they're probably a little bit green, to be honest, but they're just developing now to be. So you look at these wines and they're delicious drinking now, but you stick them away in the cellar for 10 years and they'll still be even more delicious drinking. So that's the difference. Yeah.
There's a complexity of expression of Cabernet through them. So that's a little bit of a taste of Coonawarra at the moment from us during vintage here in Coonawarra. I just really want to thank our panellists for giving up their time. Thank the wineries for their wines, and to those of you that have tuned in, really appreciate your interest in Coonawarra. We can't wait to see you here one day. And Wine Australia and I think the Department for Trade and Investment in South Australia helped put this forward as well. So thanks a lot for tuning in, and any questions that we haven't been able to answer, we promise to follow through online afterwards. So thank you very much, everyone, and here's to a great 2022 vintage. Cheers. See you at tea night tomorrow night.